I think the lowest point in that transition was going from walking to using a wheelchair. And I think it's only natural for you to want to carry on doing what you're doing for as long as you can. I think that's a good thing, but it starts to work against you eventually. For example, I carried on walking for too long. I'm 6'4". I'm a big guy. It's a long way down. I remember once I went to the petrol station and then whilst walking in to pay for the fuel, tripped over on a mat in the petrol station, and I woke up in hospital. And that was kind of one of those moments you think, I've got to do something different here. This isn't working. So within one day, I was, independently filling my car with petrol, to the next day thinking, this has got to change. But yeah, that journey to using a chair is really tough. I really can't empathise with anybody that has to make the move to a wheelchair. But ultimately, it's a really positive thing to do. I remember I became pretty much reclusive, not leaving the house, because you're frightened of falling over or things happening. And I remember when I did eventually start to use a power chair, an electric wheelchair that I bought second-hand, it was an absolute revelation to go back to Tesco's and buy a pint of milk, something I hadn't done for 2 years. And I realised actually the chair doesn't inhibit what you can do, it actually enables you to get back to some normality.
So Mike, welcome to Inspirability today. You are the CEO of Aerobility, a charity which helps people with disabilities discover the magic and wonder of flight. You've also been awarded an MBE for your services to disability within aviation. So welcome today, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Harriet. It's a pleasure.
So your story, though, also is one very much of overcoming adversity and showing incredible resilience. So there's a lot, I think, that many of our viewers and listeners will resonate with today, and I'm very much looking forward to you sharing it with us.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a real pleasure, as I said. I'm very happy to share my story. I think for all of us, it's our normal, but maybe, something that's happened in the past, some of my experiences, you never know, might resonate with people watching, and very pleased to tell the story.
So first of all then, put it into context for me. Tell me, who is Mike? Tell me about your childhood and growing up and what you wanted to be when you grew up.
I was really lucky to have a really, stable, normal upbringing with my family, and I think, a fairly unremarkable childhood in many ways, which is a good thing, I think. When you're young, to grow up in that environment, supportive parents, supportive environment, and actually some of the things that happened to me in my childhood, I can definitely say now have really influenced me. So I think, for example, the journey into aviation was very much started by some childhood activities and exposures that I had, which sort of take us on the journey we get to later in life.
So how did you get that initial spark then into aviation as a child?
I was thinking about this the other day. I think things sort of build up when you're a child that sort of help you reinforce and start you on that journey. For example, I remember my father went on business to America when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and he brought back from America a model airplane kit, which he gave to me and I built, and I think that started that interest in aviation. Also, I think growing up next to a playing field where people used to fly radio control models when I was really young, sort of started to start that interest in aviation and flight and looking skyward. And when I was at school, I was in the air cadets, and when I was a teenager, I learned to glide. So I think all those things, all those exposures, made me realise that the passion really was flight.
And what did you want to be when you grew up? What was your ambition?
I think, it's pretty obvious. I wanted to be a pilot or work in aviation. So I think when you have something that interesting and something you're so passionate about at an early age, it's only natural to try and turn that into a career.
So tell me about your journey then from school or after school into sort of starting flying training.
Yeah, I think I wasn't the best at school. I was always distracted by looking out the window, looking at the sky, looking at the clouds. wondering about whether I'll be able to go fly my radio control model that evening or go and fly at the gliding club at the weekend rather than doing homework. So my parents will tell you I was never the most academic because I was always being distracted by flight. But yeah, so I went through school, did O-levels in those days, A-levels, and then I was I did my PPL by working at the local flying school, getting paid in flying hours, that kind of stuff. Became a gliding instructor, so I had summer jobs. And I really thought this is my path. I sort of applied to become an airline pilot with some of the cadet schemes that were available at the time. And I thought I ought to apply to university as well, just in case I didn't get on the cadetship. And it was probably a good idea because I was unsuccessful. I wasn't able to get a cadetship, which was pretty hotly contested at the time. So I ended up going to Wales to do a degree in geology. Really, I like the idea of geology because it's being out and about, out in the open, looking at rocks, going to mountains and beaches and things to look at the rocks. I think the 2 months field trip to the mountains of Spain was really attractive at the time. That's why I chose it. And actually having that backup plan as getting a degree turned out to be really useful in the future when it was clear I wasn't going to be able to fly for a living. But throughout that time, I flew in my spare time, built hours, flying glider tugs and things like that. Also with the hope to maybe do a commercial license myself. So the so-called self-improver route to build flying hours, do your flying exams to get your commercial pilot's license that way. So I did all that together at the same time as my degree.
So your cadetships then that you applied for, but sadly weren't successful for, was that the first time you'd been rejected for something that you'd applied for? And if so, how did you process that?
Yeah, I think it probably was the first big failure in life. Yeah, I think when you are lucky enough to have a stable, loving family environment to grow up in, it's very supportive, and there aren't a huge amount of negatives. So maybe it was arrogance, or maybe I felt, I'm a keen pilot. I'm quite a good pilot at the time. I seem to have a good aptitude for it, or some people used to tell me that. So you kind of think, oh, well, they're bound to want me, but for whatever reason they didn't. So learning then early on about having a backup plan, having other ways to do things, probably is something that stood me in good stead later in life.
And in terms of processing, managing failure, dealing with failure, for anybody listening to this who is perhaps struggling in a similar situation of their own, what advice would you give?
Well, if you're passionate about something, you really want to do it, you owe it to yourself to keep trying, to think about other ways to get to that end goal. But the flip side to that is you've got to be realistic. I could very well say, as a disabled person, I'd like to be a commercial pilot, but of course that's completely unrealistic. So your goals have to be, sufficiently sort of challenging to make it worthwhile to get to, but also realistic. If it's not something that is ever possible, don't waste your time trying to do it. Don't become deluded that it is possible. So find that balance between reality and what is something that is going to challenge you and fulfill you when you actually get there.
So then you went on to university to study geology. Tell me about that and then the path afterwards.
I loved university. It was great. It was socially brilliant. I think we all do a lot of growing up. If we're lucky enough to go to university, that's when your sort of first adventures, living on your own, decision making about some of life's bigger challenges are there. Relationships and things like that. That all tends to be something that you do and have the chance to focus on in university. But also, again, flight had a negative impact because I was so preoccupied. Going gliding, going flying. I was on the British gliding team, so I ended up going to Sweden and things in the summer, flying in the Junior British Gliding Championships, things like that. So I became so distracted. I enjoyed my second year so much at university. Let's just say I had to do it twice. Because the first time round I failed it because I was just always in the airfield. So again, there's a positive, negative, or negative, positive, depending on how you look at it.
So how did you get into being on the British gliding team? That's an incredible achievement.
Again, I was lucky in the sense that I lived near a gliding club that was very good at supporting young people. Lasham Gliding Club in Hampshire. They had a great scheme for young people that helped them to do lots of flying, lots of gliding. And I think when you're a teenager, you just get on and do it. You don't second guess yourself. And I seem to have a good aptitude for it. So I was lucky enough to be lent some good quality equipment. When people see that you have the aptitude for it and you're worth investing in, I was able to use some good gliders and fly with some good people more experienced than me to pick up the skills, the competition skills. And I actually found the FIA diploma the other day, sorting out an old cupboard at home, having a bit of a sort out. And I forgot that I come 10th in my first ever international competition. I thought, actually, for 18, 19 years old, that's pretty good going. So, yeah, looking back, I was lucky, but also I fought for it. I really wanted it. But as I say, my university performance suffered a little bit because of it.
So with the pressure and dealing with being, in incredibly important international competitions, how did you handle that? And maybe what advice would you give to anybody listening who is going through a test or an exam situation, a situation where they have to perform, like you were in the British gliding team? What advice can you share?
Well, I think those around you will tell me a strength and a weakness of mine is that I'm quite relaxed, laid back, don't tend to stress out about things. So again, when you're younger, you don't know any different. So just went ahead and did it, really. I'd like to say there was some sort of mental fortitude or something exciting about it. But we are what we are to a certain extent. And for me, that was my happy place, was just to do these things, push myself, enjoy it, and do the best that we can.
So after university and your time gliding at university, what was next?
So I was a gliding instructor for a couple of summers. Also, I was on my way to my commercial pilot's license, as I mentioned. So I got a job flying glider tugs at the local gliding club. So I flew an amazing out. Some days I would fly for 7 or 8 hours, just going up and down all day, towing up gliders. And I love that existence because you lived in a caravan on the airfield, you put on your shorts in the morning, you flew airplanes all day, then had a beer in the evening in the bar with friends, and repeat the next day. It was a magical summer. And then that winter, I went to fly at an airfield in Scotland, also flying glider tugs and doing gliding instruction. So it was a great, again, a similar existence, but in the beautiful Highlands of Scotland. So that a couple of years doing that, doing nearly 2,000 hours flying, was just brilliant. It was a time I'll never forget. I really appreciate the fact that I did it. And of course, at the time, I thought, right, I'll get the hours done, then I'll do my commercial pilot's exams and the flying test down at Bournemouth Airport, which I did. So I did all the ground exams. But unfortunately, then was about that I started to notice that I had some weakness in my arms.
So you started noticing some weakness in your arms.
Yes.
So at what point did you realise that your path in life was going to drastically change from where you were hoping to go?
Yeah, I think probably for a year or two before that, subconsciously I knew that something physically in the body wasn't quite right. I think with any progressive condition like I have, it does start very slowly and very subtly. But I started to notice I couldn't run long distances. Funny things, just like playing badminton or tennis. One year my serve was nice and strong. The year after, when I was in at university rather, I noticed that it was getting harder to really hit the ball harder, things like that. So I guess that crept up in you when you put that to the back of your head. There's lots of other stuff going on in life. But then really when I couldn't lift my arms fully above my head, thought something a bit weird going on here. So I went to see my GP, and my GP said, this is not something I come across very often. Don't like the look of this. We'll send you to a neurologist. Went to see a neurologist at Oxford University, who said, this is, looks like something like muscular dystrophy. So that was really the first indication that something was possibly wrong. Then after a couple of blood tests and some other examinations, yes, it was confirmed as a type of muscular dystrophy. So huge shock, literally everything you want to do, thought you could do, gets ripped out from underneath you. So, that's, obviously huge, one of life's big shocks, life's lows. But again, it's in my nature to think, right, okay, we've got a problem here, but let's find out a way that we can not solve it, but perhaps find a way to continue to move things forward in a positive way.
So, Mike, talk to me a little bit more about the transition then from becoming fully able-bodied, being a glider pilot on the British gliding team, to then a wheelchair user. Tell me how you found that transition and how you processed it.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things in life where it's the best of life and the worst of life. On one hand, I was down at staying in a friend's house, studying down at Bournemouth Airport, doing my written CPL exams, my commercial pilot exams. I was doing my instrument rating, I was doing my twin rating, I was doing things I loved doing, but also aware that things weren't quite right with my muscles and things like that. So it was kind of really good fun days, but really bad days as well, in the sense that something's not quite right here. So again, as I mentioned, I was going through some medical assessments and tests and things like that. So although I passed all my exams and everything I did on my commercial, clearly then the class one was in jeopardy, the class one commercial medical that you have to have as a commercial pilot. So it became clear that I was not going to be able to keep my class one. So then, the whole world came crashing down. What are you going to do, Michael? What's life going to hold for you? You worry about some of the basics in life. Am I going to be able to walk, be independent, do the things I love doing, including carry on flying? But I was really lucky that as part of the general aviation community, the gliding community, I had some amazing friends, and they could sense that things were going to be an issue, and I was sort of confiding in some of them about the challenges I was having. I had a friend in the gliding world who was a senior manager in a pharmaceutical company. And she said, well, you need to earn money while you sort all this out. Why don't you come and work at the company that I work for, which is a big Swiss pharmaceutical company, and start to help with just doing some temping, really. So I started doing that and ended up sort of building a career in the pharmaceutical industry. So sort of accidental career. I ended up running drug trials, of all things. So maybe from aviation into running drug trials, or, whilst also carrying on the fight to fly myself. So clearly I wasn't going to be a commercial pilot, but for as long as I could, I wanted to continue flying gliders and light aeroplanes while it was safe to do so. So I was able to hold my Class 2 medical for a fair few years after that, so I carried on flying. But all the time losing the ability to move quite so well. So clearly, as I mentioned, my arms got weaker and weaker, and my legs. Basically, muscular dystrophy, all the type that I have, makes all your limbs weaker and weaker over time. So I think the lowest point in that transition was going from walking to using a wheelchair. I know this sounds weird, but in some ways I envy people that happens overnight, perhaps a catastrophic incident. You don't have any choice. You've got to go into the chair. That's just the only way you're going to be able to move around. But for me, over about a 2-year period from being able to walk quite well to actually then it being a danger to walk. And I think it's only natural for you to want to carry on doing what you're doing for as long as you can. I think that's a good thing, but it starts to work against you eventually. For example, I carried on walking for too long. I'm 6'4". I'm a big guy. It's a long way down. I remember once I went to the petrol station on the M3 motorway services. I filled up my car with petrol. I had a Subaru Impreza rally car, which I loved. But that's another story. But I was refueling the car, and then whilst walking in to pay for the fuel, tripped over on a mat in the petrol station. It's a solid marble floor. Obviously, with my arms being weak, couldn't put my arms out to stop myself. And I woke up in hospital. And apparently I tripped over, headbutted the floor in the petrol station. Still see the scar above my eye to this day. And lost about 2 pints of blood on the floor of the petrol station. And been ambulanced into the local A&E. Now that was kind of one of those moments you think, I've got to do something different here. This isn't working. So within one day, I was, independently filling my car with petrol. To the next day, thinking this has got to change. I've got to start using a chair or a walker or sticks or some way of moving around safely. So life gives you those shocks, those moments to actually help you recalibrate the way you think about doing things. But yeah, that journey to using a chair is really tough. I really can't empathise with anybody that has to make the move to a wheelchair. But ultimately, it's a really positive thing to do. I remember I became pretty much reclusive, not leaving the house, because you're frightened of falling over or things happening. And even little things you start to miss, like going to Tesco's to do the family shop once a week, things like that. Once you can't do them, you start to realise that you're starting to miss out on the basics. And I remember when I did eventually start to use a power chair, an electric wheelchair that I bought second hand, it was an absolute revelation to go back to Tesco's and buy a pint of milk, something I hadn't done for 2 years. And I realised actually the chair doesn't inhibit what you can do. It actually enables you to get back to some normality, which is what we all need as human beings. So, yeah, moments like that, you realise, yeah, I've got to stick with this. I've got to persevere. And actually, a wheelchair is an enabler, not something that takes away your capability.